Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, John, for a lovely introduction. So as has been mentioned, I'm a privacy counsel at OneTrust, which means that I not only have say, hopefully, in developing the privacy software, but I'm also responsible for being compliant with all the privacy laws out there. So I struggle with very much the same problems that you do. And I really like what John mentioned in the beginning, in the opening keynote, that right now we're at a stage with our privacy compliance where we would like to maybe look a bit more into how do we move beyond the compliance on paper, because as we probably all have experienced, firstly, the GDPR for us, the deadline was about, okay, how do we make it happen? How do we make it at least happen on paper? But now, as we have moved beyond the deadline, we're kind of wondering, okay, how do we sustain it? How do we actually make it work in practice? And how do we make it functional in a way that it's perhaps a bit less of a burden and perhaps a bit more insightful, not just for us, but for the rest of the company. And with that, I would like to highlight one of the prime issues where we see a lot of companies, as well as the regulators, highlighting it as one of the key problems in terms of bringing the privacy compliance into practice, and that's the third-party vendor risk. So I guess the key for me here, and I suppose for you too, is that we have spent a lot of time worrying about our own privacy compliance, about the fact that we in our company do everything right as much as we can. But sometimes it's kind of scary to realize that maybe our vendors, our processors and sub-processors all the way down the vendor chain may not have enough time to worry about that, and maybe we don't have enough control to be aware of what is actually happening with them all the way down our processor chain. But we all know that every chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and actually majority of data breaches are driven by not the company which is the controller, but unfortunately by one of those companies down the processor chain. So that's why I see this as a prime issue for us to get right on the functional, practical compliance side of things. And I would just like to maybe walk you through a few things on the practical side of things, practical steps that we're seeing help us get things in order and get us a little bit more control and maybe oversight over what's happening with our processors and sub-processors. Looking at what is actually the vendor risk management lifecycle, I would like to highlight a few methods of how do we actually manage the third-party risks inherent with the fact that we're sharing data, not just personal data, but of course those as well with other companies. So firstly, we're seeing companies, start with the assessments. The fact that we need to understand what is happening with this particular company, a business partner. Is this a key business partner? What types of data are involved? So that's probably the first thing. Second thing is the exchange of information, the fact that maybe someone has worked with that business before and maybe they have the answers and we might want to leverage that. So that's the sort of third-party risk exchange we're seeing as an element coming into play here as well. And finally, and that's probably something that we're all aware of, it's the fact that when we're onboarding, that shouldn't be the end of our conversation with that particular business partner, but it's just the beginning. And we need to monitor what's going on with those companies all the way throughout the life cycle of our cooperation, right up till the end when we're offboarding them. So maybe if we look at that type of life cycle of managing our third parties, there's definitely several elements there. So firstly, we need to become aware that there might be a new business partner coming up. And all of those who are with the privacy or compliance office are very well aware that that's not a given. Sometimes some of our other departments would be very eager to get somebody on board, and they might kind of get ahead of themselves and they might not necessarily involve the privacy office straight on. So that's why it's so important to learn about new business partners coming on. Secondly, we need to be aware of what type of data is being exchanged with that party, and we need to be able to assess those parties based on what type of risks they might present and review them periodically. we also need to be able to mitigate any type of risks that are coming up with those particular partners. So the fact that they might have some issues and we want to look into those issues maybe with their cloud storage, or maybe with the fact that they handle internally certain breaches not in an adequate manner. Secondly, there is the fact that we also might want to report on what we've been doing, not just necessarily to the regulators, because as we know, the enforcement is only the last step of the whole process. But we're more concerned with our own internal audits, or maybe audits from our own business partners, or maybe the fact that we want to report to the management how well we're doing. And all of that should be sort of wrapped up in this, I guess, general fact that we want to monitor what's going on with these business partners, also in a situation where, for instance, they might be changing their services and we might want to do a bit more with them, or the fact that they have just been acquired, which we know happens so much with the tech vendors, or the fact that maybe we would want to look into cooperating with them in a long-term perspective a bit more. So if we look at these elements a bit more in detail in terms of how do we actually facilitate this, how do we actually make it a bit easier, not just for the privacy office, but hopefully also for other departments, because let's face it, this is not just our concern. This is actually an opportunity for collaboration with security, or for collaboration with legal department, or the fact that we might want to help our procurement or any other business owners who are actually excited about the fact that we might want to scale down the time of vetting and onboarding new business partner. So with that being said, the fact that we need to first face the challenge of being able to identify that we have a new business partner coming up straight ahead as soon as possible. I would say that the first step to do that successfully is bringing more people into the game. As you well know, not everybody always involves privacy office straight up. So why don't we make it a bit easier for the business owners to give us that information as soon as possible about the fact that they want to involve some new company. Self-service portal will be the obvious easy way. When they have online access, they fill out a predefined form, and that way we're notified as soon as possible. It's easier for them, it's easier for us, instead of chasing them physically. Also, sometimes it might be easier to rely on systems that are already, I guess, familiar within the company. And maybe you already have a procurement system that helps the business owners onboard new businesses. So why don't we integrate those with your privacy tools? And that way you can get the latest source of truth kind of information straight into your privacy assessment. And you can get that 360 view of what's going on with that particular vendor straight from the point when you're meeting them for the first time. And lastly, sometimes it helps just to have some legacy data bulk imported into your privacy systems. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that right now a lot of us are relying on Excel sheets. And I guess what I'm primarily missing from Excel sheets or any other way that we're trying to get that information about our vendors in is the fact that we're never seeing the full picture. And in order for us to get the full picture about what's happening with that particular vendor, why are they important? What are the risks? How have we treated the risks? The fact is that if we don't have the full picture of all of these elements together, it is very hard for us to get the right approach in with respect to how do we treat them, how often do we audit them. And it increases the risks that we might have missed something really important that's going to come around and bite us down the road. So that's why I, for one, really pioneer having all that view of all the information about the vendor all in one place. So moving on to the next stage, when we already know about the vendor, what do we want to do next? I suggest that we want to sort of start with sort of a baseline in terms of our due diligence when we're onboarding a new company, new vendor, new processor of data. So I would recommend maybe we don't want to start from scratch. Maybe we don't want to start from level 0 when we just send them, okay, what's the name of your company? What type of certification do you have? What do you do? maybe we would like to leverage information that has already been answered by that company, because let's face it, we all do it, and we all do it pretty much in a very similar way. We all ask very similar set of questions about your security certifications, what do you do to avoid certain risks. So very often there is a way to leverage that information that is already publicly available on that vendor. Maybe through Privacy Shield certification, maybe through other information they have available on their security. So I would suggest maybe unloading that information first, pre-populating your forms and starting from there. Secondly, I would also suggest that it also makes a lot of sense to exchange that type of information. Very often companies make it available from third parties to actually unload that information about your potential vendor into your system. And again, you will be able to leverage, not from scratch, but you already have a very good knowledge about the fact that a particular vendor has ISO certification, ISO 27001 or 2, the fact that they are also Privacy Shield certified, the fact that they might also have another set of NIST certifications, and that will already give you a very nice start in assessing whether you need to send them a bit more detailed assessment about their privacy and security measures. So once we're actually in the stage where we already have some baseline information about the vendor and we're looking at how do we assess them and what risks they might be posing, I would suggest, again, automating most of that part. And the reason is that way it's probably the best to ensure that you're maintaining, I would say, harmonized approach towards how do you treat your vendors. Because that's what we really need, is consistency. We want to be able to treat high-risk vendors consistently and maybe in a different tiered approach to low-risk vendors. And that consistency is best achieved through the fact that you might already have some pre-populated workflows that will tell you, okay, if this vendor flags that, for instance, they are hosting their servers in some African country, and we're planning to send most of our business's data over there, this will probably flag as a high risk for our security team and also for our privacy team. And if this happens, then we have this particular workflow that will list all the steps we need to do to make sure that this vendor passes through our audit. Another thing that is probably helpful is, and that's something I mentioned, the fact that we need to have dynamic assessments. The fact that maybe if the vendor passes through most of our questions, but they flag this one question which might be a risk, the fact that maybe they don't have a DPO and they should have a DPO, that's something that should, again, automatically trigger another set of questions. And there shouldn't have to be a person on the privacy office manually sifting through those questions. That's something that we can probably automate as well. And we can automatically have them answer additional set of questions based on that. And finally, and that's something I love to hear as a privacy lawyer myself, there is a way to also outsource some of that chasing, in the fact that we need some answers to those forms and templates and assessments that we're exchanging with our business partners. So again, there is a way to automate these things, and I would also argue that it saves us a lot of time and the heavy lifting by outsourcing the chasing and the fact that I don't need to keep sending 10 emails to all the business partners to finally open their emails and read through their questionnaires, because I believe that our time should be spent on the more important and more valuable assessments. With that being said, I guess the most important part for us with new vendors is being able to mitigate the risks that they present. And for that, I really believe that we need to be able to assess what is actually happening with the vendors. So here is where this 360 view of the vendor, from the perspective of their security measures in place, from the perspective of what data they handle, really comes into play. And I really believe that here is where the standardization also is very important. The fact that we have standardized set of risks that we apply across all our vendors. The fact that maybe if this is something that we identify as a risk, we look for it with all the vendors. And we make sure that if this is flagged, we know how to treat it and how to mitigate it. That's something that I believe is really important. So it's not just about flagging the risks and then leaving them somewhere in the Excel sheets, but it's also the fact that we know how we treat those risks, how we mitigate them, and how we review them. And finally, and that's probably something that's very important as well, and sometimes we forget about it, we need to be able to create this audit trail of how we actually do all of that risk assessment with our vendors. So I believe that's something that is especially important when we're not just looking at it internally, but also whenever any problem happens. So when you actually have a problem with the vendor, and there might be a breach involved, the first thing you want to look at is, okay, did we do everything right according to our controls to the risks? Did we audit the vendor? And the answer to it should be automatically populated based on what you already have done with the vendor. You don't want to start creating that audit trail at a point when things start to go south. So that's, again, probably one of the strong arguments for having a system in place to help you automatically populate that audit trail and to also help you report to your management on how well we're doing and which kinds of vendors might be problematic and for what reasons. And finally, we always need to be aware, and I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir here, we always need to be aware that the road doesn't end with the onboarding. There may be so many issues with the vendors that come up during the relationship, so many changes of products, the fact that they experienced a data breach, the fact that they had been acquired by a company we know nothing about. All of those things need to be ideally automatically flagged to us through our privacy system, and we should be able to respond to them by maybe issuing a new specific audit, or maybe by sending out a new assessment. So here is a summary of what are the steps in what I envision to be this more enhanced vendor risk management lifecycle. And as you are probably familiar, as a matter of fact, we do create software to help with that privacy, and I use it internally also for our own compliance. So I'm aware that it does help to tackle some of those issues, and that would be the vendor risk management module that we issue to help with this type of issues and questions that we might have as a privacy office, but also it might actually very well help and facilitate the work for our security teams as well as all the other key business owners. But of course, there will be probably much more discussion for this that's available, and I'm available at our booth to answer any of those questions. But more importantly, I would also like to invite you to a set of events that we're hosting that are, I guess, similar in the nature because they're intended to help the networking and sort of, I guess, experience exchange amongst the privacy professionals. And I really love them because they're very much in-depth about sharing knowledge and the practical experience around compliance and privacy. And we're hosting them all across Europe. So feel free to please check it online and see if you want to attend one of those, because I really appreciate the fact that practical compliance is not one-way exercise. It's always about customizing the compliance towards the needs of your own company and about exchanging what works and what doesn't work amongst us privacy professionals. So that's why I really appreciate this event and how John has framed it, that this is a great opportunity for exchange of that. And I would like to follow up with that kind of discussion and that kind of mentality also with the Privacy Connect events, which you're very welcome to attend. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.